It always begins with a whisper, one so faint that most of the world dismisses it as background noise, a tremor beneath the more dramatic headlines of everyday life. Yet every now and then, someone hears that whisper clearly, long before the shadow it warns of ever reaches the horizon. For many, Sylvia Browne was one such voice, strange, polarizing, and impossible to ignore. And it is from that voice that the thread of this story unravels, leading us into the unsettling landscape of a year she claimed would re-engineer the human experience. Long before her name became synonymous with prophecy, Sylvia Browne was simply a child in a deeply Catholic household, a girl too young to understand why she heard voices no one else could hear. She would later speak of those early years not with pride or fear, but with a matter-of-fact certainty, as if hearing another presence was as normal as breathing. She said one voice in particular stayed with her, a guide she called Francine, a consciousness she believed stood on a higher plane and spoke of things far beyond the world's comprehension. Whether this was delusion, intuition, or something more is a question still argued today. But in Browne's telling, this guide never once failed her. Through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, Sylvia's life slowly transformed from eccentric spirituality into a phenomenon. She became a recurring presence on television and radio, her calm, unwavering tone cutting cleanly through the chaotic noise of American media. People grieving lost children, broken marriages, or shattered faith sought her counsel with a desperation that frightened even some of her supporters. She would sit across from a stranger, look into their eyes, and speak with the confidence of someone reading a weather forecast, detailing futures, relaying messages from beyond, predicting events that had not yet taken form. Her critics, and there were many, claimed she was simply a skilled performer, a master cold reader, a woman who knew exactly which emotional threads to pluck. They accused her of opportunism, of manipulating the vulnerable. And perhaps, in part, those accusations held weight. But even her harshest opponents acknowledged one thing. There was something uncanny about her specificity, something too precise to be dismissed as mere theatrics. Her predictions were not wrapped in hazy generalities. They were dates, symptoms, sequences, statements that demanded either belief or fear. That specificity reached its peak in 2008, when she published End of Days. Tucked inside its pages were a few lines that seemed bizarre at the time, almost unsettling in their clarity. She described a sudden respiratory illness, a pneumonia-like plague that would circle the globe in 2020, attacking the lungs and the entire system before vanishing as abruptly as it came. And then she added something stranger still, that roughly 10 years later, it would return. For most readers in 2008, these lines were simply another dramatic flourish in a book filled with dramatic flourishes. But then came the winter of 2019, then the paralysis of 2020, the panic, the locked borders, the masks, the global fear vibrating under every news report. When COVID-19 swept across continents with a speed and violence unmatched in modern memory, millions went searching for explanations, scientific, spiritual, psychological, anything to restore a sense of order. And in that search, Sylvia Browne's decade-old words resurfaced like a ghost breaking through the fog. The reaction was immediate. Newspapers reprinted the passage. Discussion panels analyzed every syllable. Social media exploded with screenshots of the page, demanding to know how. How could she have known this 12 years before it unfolded? Was it coincidence? Insight? Or a crack in the veil between what we see and what exists beneath? That rediscovered prophecy did something powerful. It placed Sylvia Browne back into the collective consciousness, not as a fringe figure, but as a terrifying possibility. A woman who may have glimpsed a sliver of the future with alarming clarity. And it is this unsettling resurgence that brings us to the heart of her most haunting prediction, the one she insisted would define not merely a crisis or a season of suffering, but the very architecture of the human soul. She wrote that 2020 was never the main event. It was only the opening tremor of a greater shift, a subtle reordering of the world's internal balance. The illnesses, the divisions, the emotional fractures of the early 2020s These were the symptoms, not the cause. The world, she believed, was being prepared for something quieter, darker, more intimate than any war or disaster. Something not outside us, but inside. That moment, she said, would come in 2026. Even today, as the year approaches, those words carry a weight that feels disproportionate for a simple date. Perhaps it is because every year since 2020 has left humanity more fatigued, more uncertain, more fragmented. Perhaps it is because the invisible wounds of the last decade linger beneath the surface of our daily routines. Or perhaps it is because the world has already begun to sense, in ways difficult to articulate, that some unseen tectonic plate is shifting beneath us. Whatever the reason, Sylvia's writings about 2026 no longer feel like a distant curiosity. They read instead like a cipher, a riddle pointing to a moment we cannot yet name, but somehow feel approaching. She wrote not of storms or famines or fire, but of a great spiritual stillness, a silence spreading through the human heart until people found themselves unable to recognize their own reflection. A collapse not of buildings, but of meaning. And as her old words grow disturbingly relevant, a single question rises quietly, insistently, refusing to be silenced by reason or skepticism. If she was right about 2020, what does that mean for what she saw in the year that now stands before us? This is where our journey begins, with the woman who claimed she could see the shape of tomorrow before tomorrow ever arrived, and with the unsettling possibility that her most terrifying vision has yet to unfold. The 2020s were not supposed to feel like this. When the century first opened its doors, people imagined a world moving upward, toward cleaner skies, smarter cities, longer lives. Instead, the decade unfolded like a slow leak in the human spirit, a quiet unraveling that no one could pinpoint, yet everyone could feel. Sylvia Browne warned that the early 2020s would be a time when the world began losing its sense of direction, not through sudden catastrophe but through an accumulation of small fractures, barely noticeable at first. And as we step deeper into this decade, her words echo with an almost uncomfortable precision. The pandemic was only the spark, the moment that jolted humanity awake to the fragility of the structures we trusted. But once the initial wave of chaos passed, something stranger lingered beneath the surface. It wasn't the illness that haunted us. It was the aftertaste of isolation, the way time began to stretch and contract unnaturally, the way so many discovered that the silence inside their own homes was louder than any news report. Even now, years later, that silence has not completely faded. It clings like a residue to our commutes, our conversations, our restless scrolling through glowing screens. Sylvia wrote that the 2020s would be a decade defined not by one great disaster, but by the erosion of inner certainty. Look around today, and the texture of that erosion is unmistakable. You can see it in the way conversations break down over the smallest disagreements, in the way trust in institutions, political, scientific, even spiritual, seems to evaporate faster than it can be rebuilt. You can see it in families that share a roof but not a connection, in friendships frayed by distance even when measured in a few miles, in the strange numbness that settles over entire communities like a fog no weather satellite can track. For some, these changes felt like coincidence. For others, like symptoms. But for Sylvia Browne, this was the prelude, the period of quiet destabilization that would prepare humanity for what she called the true trial of the soul. In her vision, the 2020s were not a time of visible collapse, but something far more elusive, a soft decay of the human interior, a subtle drift away from purpose. People would still go to work, still share photos, still laugh, still plan, but something essential would begin slipping through their fingers without them noticing. And then came the technological acceleration, so rapid, so relentless, that many found themselves unable to process what it meant. Every year, devices grew smarter, while humans felt increasingly fragmented. Algorithms learned to finish our sentences, predict our desires, shape our moods. Sylvia warned of this with eerie explicitness. Technology advancing at a speed the human psyche cannot keep up with. Not because technology is evil, but because the soul is slow. It does not evolve in updates or patches. It needs stillness, reflection, meaning. Without these, she wrote, overwhelm becomes the modern plague, one without symptoms visible to any doctor. Perhaps that is why, in these years, exhaustion has become the quiet companion of nearly everyone. Not the exhaustion of physical labor or long days, but a deeper, more existential fatigue. A weariness even sleep cannot erase. Sylvia described it as the hollow ache of directionlessness, the feeling of being untethered even while life moves forward. And as she predicted, this feeling does not strike loudly. It seeps in. It wraps around daily habits until people no longer remember who they were before the fog settled. But the most chilling part of her vision for this decade was not emotional or technological. It was spiritual. She believed the 2020s would create a generation that no longer knows what to believe in, not because faith has vanished, but because competing truths collide so violently that all truth becomes suspect. She foresaw an era where people would question everything except their own confusion, where certainty would be replaced by noise, and where silence, true silence, would become almost unbearable. You can see the reflection of this everywhere now. In the way news cycles spiral into outrage. In how people cling to narratives that comfort their fears but rarely challenge them. In how the digital world has become a sanctuary for anxiety. A place where the mind is constantly fed but seldom nourished. Sylvia warned that this would be the most dangerous period, not because of conflict or disease, but because people would forget how to listen to their own inner voice. She wrote that when a society becomes overwhelmed by choice, speed and noise, meaning becomes diluted. People begin to float, drifting from one distraction to another, unable to anchor themselves in anything lasting. And when meaning fades, the human heart begins to weaken, not physically but spiritually, like a muscle forgotten, unused. Yet Sylvia did not frame this collapse as chaos. She framed it as preparation. A long, slow descent into a state where the world appears intact, while the inner world frays at the edges. She believed that the 2020s would bring humanity to a precipice, a moment when the internal fractures become impossible to ignore. And it is at that edge, she wrote, that the year 2026 reveals its true consequence. Because while the pandemic, the disconnection, the mistrust, the fatigue, and even the technological surge are all visible symptoms, Sylvia insisted that something deeper has been moving beneath them. A convergence, a gathering of pressures not yet named, a transformation not yet understood. And as each year edges closer to 2026, the space between what we know and what we sense begins to narrow. The world may still look functional, she warned, but the soul of the world is shifting. The decade is not collapsing outward. It is collapsing inward, folding into the quiet spaces of the mind where fear and meaning clash in silence. And in that silence, Sylvia wrote, the true warning begins to take shape. Because 2026 is not an end. It is the point where the gradual becomes sudden, where the slow fracture becomes a clean break. A moment when the internal tremors of this decade align into something humanity can no longer ignore. It begins quietly. So quietly that most people mistake it for exhaustion or stress or the natural heaviness of adulthood. A worker staring blankly at a glowing screen long after their mind has gone numb. A parent moving through the motions of dinner and bedtime, yet feeling strangely detached, as if watching their own life through a pane of glass. Friends sitting together, each illuminated by the cold glow of their phones, speaking less, scrolling more. These are not dramatic scenes. These are the unnoticed moments of everyday life. And yet Sylvia Browne believed these were the earliest signs of something far greater, the slow dimming of the inner light that once made us human. She wrote that by the mid-2020s, people would begin to experience a peculiar emptiness. Not depression in the clinical sense, but a kind of spiritual numbness, a hollowing out of meaning that words cannot fully capture. It would feel like waking up each morning to a world that appears unchanged, yet somehow, no longer fits. A sense that life continues, but the person living it has drifted a few inches outside their own skin. And perhaps the most chilling part of her vision was that this feeling would not belong to a few troubled souls. It would ripple across entire populations. People would still laugh, still shop, still work, still plan vacations, still fill their days with tasks and noise. But beneath that polished surface, something would be missing. Sylvia described it as the silent collapse, a quiet cracking in the inner walls of humanity. Not enough to cause panic, but enough to drain color from life one shade at a time. In her writings, she emphasized that this emptiness cannot be measured by any scientific instrument. No scan will show it, no specialist will diagnose it. It is an ache of the spirit, not of the body. A drifting away from purpose, a slow erosion of the invisible thread that ties people to meaning. She believed that by 2026, this would become the defining condition of the human era. Not sickness of the flesh, but sickness of the soul. And then, she warned, the earth itself would begin to mirror this inner decline. Sylvia did not describe climate change as scientists do. She never spoke of greenhouse gases, melting ice, or rising seas. Instead, she saw the natural world as a living mirror of human consciousness, an ancient reflective surface that reveals the state of the collective soul. When humanity loses balance, the earth, in her view, begins to respond. She wrote of confused seasons, a phrase that once sounded poetic, but now feels eerily literal. Winters that arrive like a rumor and vanish overnight. Summers that burn with no memory of mercy. Rain falling in deserts where the sky had been dry for generations. Storms appearing without the usual warnings, hitting coastlines with a ferocity no model predicted. In her vision, these were not merely meteorological oddities. They were signals, messages, warnings whispered through wind, water, and shifting temperatures. Nature's attempt to speak when human beings no longer listen to their own souls. Look around today, and the landscape bears a strange resemblance to her writings. Birds migrating at the wrong times. Ocean currents behaving unpredictably. Animals appearing in places they have never been seen before. Even those who do not believe in prophecy can feel the heaviness of the natural world, as though the earth itself is uneasy, restless, unsettled. Sylvia believed this environmental confusion was not random. It was the earth reacting to the spiritual imbalance of its inhabitants, as though human detachment had disrupted a harmony older than civilization. When humans forget who they are, she warned, the earth forgets how to behave. And yet, this reflection between humanity and nature was only one layer of her vision. Beneath it lay something far more enigmatic, a force without shape or name, moving through societies like smoke, unseen yet felt by anyone who pauses long enough to notice. Sylvia said this force would not tear down buildings or bring fire from the sky. Instead, it would work in silence, draining the human spirit gradually, leaving no obvious wounds. She described it as a gentle dimming of the inner fire, a process so subtle that people would mistake it for personal failure, burnout, midlife crisis, emotional fatigue, never realizing they were part of a much larger spiritual phenomenon. This force would manifest in small, intimate ways. A mother feeling strangely distant from her own child. A man looking into the mirror and not recognizing the eyes staring back. Neighbors becoming polite strangers who share walls but never lives. Human interaction, once textured and warm, would become flat, transactional, punctuated by pauses that feel too long and conversations that feel too short. Even leisure would lose its taste, joy becoming faint, laughter becoming thin. People would begin to sense that something is wrong, but would be unable to articulate what, exactly, is slipping away. According to Sylvia, the danger of this phenomenon is not its pain, but its quietness. Loud suffering forces action. Silent suffering sutures itself into the fabric of daily life until it becomes normal. And that normalization, she said, is the true crisis. The Earth's strange shifts, the emotional numbness, the quiet disconnection. These were not separate threads in Sylvia's view. They were the beginnings of a larger unraveling, pulling humanity toward a moment of profound reckoning. A moment she placed squarely in 2026. For if the soul grows silent long enough, she warned, the world around it follows. And when an entire species begins to lose the memory of meaning, the earth can do nothing but echo that silence back. The stillness builds, the weight increases, and the invisible fractures deepen until something no one can yet name, finally gives way. Sylvia believed we were approaching that point. The question, she wrote, was not whether it would come, but whether humanity would notice the signs before the silence became absolute. It often begins as convenience, a tap to unlock a door, a whispered command to a device that listens more attentively than any human ever has, a glowing screen that remembers birthdays, meetings, desires, fears, sometimes even before the person behind the screen remembers them. None of these things feel sinister on their own. They feel helpful, modern, efficient. But Sylvia Browne believed that this rising dependence marked the slow turning of a spiritual hinge, one that would reshape humanity's relationship with itself, with truth, and with the divine. She never condemned technology outright. In her writings, she described it as a tool of extraordinary potential, capable of saving lives, connecting continents, and carrying the sum of human knowledge in machines small enough to slip into a pocket. But she warned of a fault line that would split open as technology grew faster than the human spirit could adapt. A moment when people would begin to place more trust in the cold logic of algorithms than in the quiet wisdom of the soul. A time when even the idea of seeking guidance through prayer, contemplation, or inner reflection would feel outdated compared to the immediacy of digital answers. And today, as algorithms suggest what to watch, what to buy, what to believe, what to fear, Sylvia's warning feels less like mysticism and more like an uncomfortable mirror. People ask search engines for clarity instead of sitting with their own questions. They chase the comfort of certainty delivered in milliseconds, forgetting that some truths cannot be downloaded. They must be wrestled with, lived, discovered slowly. This shift, Sylvia believed, was not merely technological, it was spiritual, a quiet severing of the ancient thread that once tied humanity to the unseen, to intuition, to faith. She wrote that by 2026, this divide would reach its peak, creating a world where many people move through life like well-programmed machines, functional, efficient, informed, yet spiritually hollow. She described it as the war between the machine and the soul, not a war fought with weapons or rebellion, but a war of forgetting. Forgetting how to listen inward, forgetting how to seek meaning, forgetting how to believe in something that cannot be graphed or coded. But if Sylvia's vision of technology was unsettling, her view of cities in the mid-2020s was even more haunting. She foresaw urban landscapes transformed into perfectly managed environments, cleaner, safer, quieter, and infinitely more controlled. Not through force, but through incentives. Not through fear, but through promises of convenience. Cameras embedded in streetlights, sensors woven into traffic grids, digital IDs unlocking every service with frictionless ease. A world where people surrender small freedoms not because they are coerced, but because they are tired, because they are overwhelmed, because convenience becomes its own form of seduction. And in that gentle surrender, Sylvia saw the birth of what she called the cage without bars. It was not meant to evoke images of dystopian oppression. It was meant to describe a more subtle imprisonment, one that people accept willingly, even gladly. She wrote that individuals would no longer notice how much of their behavior was being shaped, nudged, and redirected by invisible systems. They would believe themselves free, even as they marched along paths predetermined by algorithms and policies designed to minimize risk, optimize productivity, and eliminate the unpredictable quirks that once made human life beautifully imperfect. In Sylvia's vision, the city becomes the perfect shepherd, always watching, always learning, always correcting. And people, fatigued by the unpredictability of life, slowly stop questioning. They confuse management with safety. They confuse surveillance with order. They confuse stillness with peace. Yet she emphasized that the greatest danger of these perfected cities was not the loss of privacy. It was the loss of imagination. When people no longer question the boundaries of their lives, they forget how to dream beyond them. They forget how to rebel, how to create, how to push against the edges of the possible. In a world where every variable is controlled, the human soul has no room to breathe. But Sylvia's warnings did not end with machines or cities. She wrote that, in this era of increasing dependence and control, another quieter crisis would unfold, the deterioration of leadership, not through scandal or disappearance, but through emptiness. Leaders in government, science, media, and even religion would still speak, still issue statements, still hold press conferences, but their words would lose substance. They would feel rehearsed, hollow, disconnected from the lived reality of the people who look to them for answers. She called it the silence behind the speeches. This, she believed, would be more destabilizing than corruption or conflict. When leaders stop speaking truth, the public does not rise in rage. Instead, they sink into uncertainty, into fear, into the creeping sense that no one, not experts, not institutions, not authorities, truly understands what is happening. And in that void, confusion becomes the loudest voice in society. People begin to doubt not only the world around them, but their own judgment. This erosion of trust, she wrote, would be the final catalyst pushing humanity toward the threshold of 2026, a moment when people find themselves suspended between two realities: the comfort of systems that keep life running smoothly, and the growing suspicion that something essential is slipping away beneath the polished surface. It is here, in this tension, between convenience and confinement, between artificial intelligence and ancient faith, between leaders who speak loudly and souls that have forgotten how to speak at all, that Sylvia believed humanity would reach a point of division, not through conflict, but through choice. A choice between living with a soul or living without one. She wrote that some would embrace the glow of the machines, allowing themselves to drift deeper into the managed silence of modern life. Others, sensing the approaching break, would begin to reach inward again, searching for the faint voice they once trusted, a voice older than technology, older than civilization, a voice that speaks not in data, but in meaning. And at the center of this divide stands 2026, not as a disaster, but as a test. The moment when the slow collapse becomes unmistakable, when the quiet fractures of the decade align into something that forces every person to confront what they have become and what they have forgotten. There are moments in history when the world seems to inhale and forget how to exhale. Moments when conversations pause mid-sentence, when screens flicker in the hands of millions, when people across continents, different languages, different beliefs, different lives, feel the same cold ripple pass through them at the exact same second. Sylvia Browne wrote that such a moment would arrive in 2026. She did not describe sirens, flames, or destruction. She described silence, a silence so sudden and absolute that it would feel as though reality itself had been gently, but unmistakably, interrupted. In her vision, the event would be brief, no more than a breath. But it would be a breath that echoed. Something would occur, seen by all, explained by none, that would make even the most rational minds stumble. She never gave its shape or cause. She simply called it the moment that stops the world. A moment when humanity collectively senses that the rules beneath their lives, the rules they never questioned, have shifted by a fraction. That something has brushed against the fabric of the ordinary. People, she said, would look at each other in confusion before they look inward in fear. Governments would scramble for explanations, offering theories built on data, physics, psychology, each sounding less convincing than the last. Specialists would be interviewed endlessly, their words polished but hollow. And in the vacuum of certainty, fear would begin to hiss in the cracks of global consciousness. Not the wild fear of riots or alarms, but a quieter, more corrosive kind. The fear of not knowing what is real. Sylvia believed this moment would not create panic immediately. Instead, it would create questions. Questions that burrow into the mind and begin the slow work of reshaping the soul. Questions like, what is happening to us? What are we becoming? What have we allowed ourselves to forget? She wrote that this event would mark the tipping point, the instant when the slow internal collapse of the decade becomes something undeniable. All the symptoms, the numbness, the emotional distance, the mistrust, the technological dependence, the environmental confusion, would suddenly feel connected, as though they were never random threads but parts of a single pattern tightening around humanity as spirit. And then she spoke of the sky. In one of her most cryptic passages, she wrote of a revelation from above, something that would appear where no human can touch, where no authority can interfere. She did not call it an object or a sign. She simply described it as something seen by all, understood by few, but felt by everyone. This was not portrayed as an omen of doom, not an invasion, nor a fiery spectacle. It was, instead, a mirror, an event that would force humanity to confront a truth it has long avoided, that we are not the center of the universe, that we never were, and that whatever consciousness watches from beyond the veil, whether divine, cosmic, or unknown, has always been closer than we imagine. This sign in the sky, Sylvia said, would divide the world in a new way, not by nation or belief, but by the state of the inner heart. Those grounded in faith, faith in God, in purpose, in the unseen, would feel a deep calm, as though something long asleep inside them had stirred. But those who clung only to systems, logic, and control would feel the ground shift beneath them, their certainties dissolving in an instant. And this division would not be visible on the surface. It would unfold quietly, like a slow separation of continents beneath the ocean. People would still greet each other, work together, share homes, exchange pleasantries. But a hidden line would form between those who stand on inner strength and those who stand on crumbling certainty. Sylvia wrote that this, not war, not famine, not fire, would be the true beginning of the great shift. For the first group, the year 2026 would become a threshold, a calling. Something deep within them would awaken with clarity, the desire to seek what is real, not what is convenient, to return to the meaning that was lost, to rebuild their lives on something sturdier than screens and systems. They would begin to pray again, not the formal prayers of ritual, but the whispered conversations with the divine that rise from the ache of the soul. They would begin to feel their hearts soften, their families reconnect, their compassion widen. They would become, in her words, the silent lights in the darkest hours. But for the second group, the year would trigger a different transformation. Not dramatic, not violent, but inward. A tightening fear, a deepening denial, a frantic clinging to the structures that once gave them certainty. They would seek control precisely because they feel it slipping away. They would double down on logic even as logic fails them. They would try to explain what cannot be explained, to measure what cannot be measured, to dismiss what cannot be ignored. And in that struggle, they would drift further from the very thing that could anchor them. Sylvia believed this divergence was the true meaning of her prophecy, that humanity would not be divided by external chaos, but by internal choice. And yet, despite all the heaviness she described, her final message was not bleak, it was luminous. She wrote that the soul, though forgotten, is not fragile. It can be buried beneath years of noise, exhaustion, and neglect, yet still reignite with a single spark of truth. She believed that the crisis of 2026 would not destroy humanity. It would expose humanity. It would strip away the false selves built from status, fear, or pride, leaving only the raw, unadorned truth of each spirit. And in that exposure, countless people would remember who they are and why they were created. Families separated by silence would rediscover one another. Communities fractured by distrust would begin to rebuild, not through grand movements, but through small acts of compassion. People whose faith had withered would find themselves praying again in the quiet hours before dawn. And that soft return, the return that cannot be forced or taught, only awakened, would become the seed of renewal. Her prophecy ends with a simple certainty, that when everything external loses its power, when governments falter, when devices fail, when logic collapses, what remains is the one foundation no darkness can break: faith. Not as doctrine, but as the quiet knowledge that we are not abandoned, that the soul has a purpose, and that even in moments when the world seems to lose its shape, something greater holds the broken pieces in place. This is the final paradox of Sylvia Browne's vision, that the most terrifying year she foresaw is also the year where countless hearts begin to rise again. And as the world moves closer to that date, the question she leaves hanging in the quiet air is no longer, what will happen? It is this: when the moment comes and the world falls silent, what will your soul hear?